A lot of people have, again, there's just been this bombardment of tweets and emails. Well, first, they're conflating two things at some point. So I just want to say again, really quickly up front, I have no problem with atheists or atheism at all. I don't personally identify as such, um, but I sort of have a profound disinterest in criticizing. I have no universal criticism of atheists at all. And a lot of my best friends are atheists. But no, but like all kidding aside, that's just not the issue. I think some people, they take atheism in a different way. It's more kind of fundamental to how they look at the world and what they think is needed to solve the world's problems. I don't share that view in the same way, but that's something that we can debate, we can talk about. I don't object to that at all in the same way that I object to some of this very specific work of Sam Harris. First of all, I want to make this brief point and be very specific, and then we'll get into the actual, Harris likes to talk a lot, he calls the terrestrial, the real world implications of things. So that's mainly what I want to focus on when I talk about Sam Harris. That's what I'm interested in. I will say up front, again, from an academic point of view, whether from the perspective of studying comparative religion, philosophy of religion, religion as a historical social phenomenon, or religion in politics or economics, his model of religion, which is basically just a literalist text reading, is a really unsophisticated one. It's not to deny that there aren't some people who take literalist interpretations of holy texts somewhat at face value, although I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who takes it as quite as literally as Harris seems to think many people do. And that, fundamentalist and extremist religion is a problem. I would suggest almost always it is a symptom resulting from other things. Very, 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 very rarely a core defining driver or explainer. So if you're trying to figure out what's happening in the Middle East, and your main metric is the Quran and the Hadith, you are going to have a profoundly limited, delusional, and wrong-headed perspective by definition. You are not going to be taking in all of the variables you need to take in to actually have a fully integrated understanding of this. Now, as an example, you want to talk about the Qatari government. Why does Qatar, allow funding for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda to move through Qatar, at the same time host a U.S. military base, have relatively nice backdoor relations with Israel, and sort of pivot against Saudi Arabia, even though they're another sort of Sunni Gulf state? It's really simple. It's because Qatar is a small island nation with an enormous amount of wealth that's playing a sort of multi-pivoted game to keep themselves insulated and protected from their immediate neighbors, and they're trying to strike alliances and calculate geopolitically as best they can. They thought the Muslim Brotherhood would stay in Egypt. They didn't. They calculated differently. Another great example of this on the opposite end, Saudi Arabia, which I agree, again, if you're talking about actual issues and actual institutions and actual religious biases, this is a regime that has specifically funded a very, very narrow, highly fundamentalist brand of Islam, of Sunni Islam, Wahhabism, which is a problem. That specifically is a problem. Now, again, but from the perspective of international relations and regional strategy, do the Saudis support the Muslim Brotherhood as part of their fellows in this, global Muslim conspiracy that people like Sam Harris seem to see? No, they don't. They actually supported a secularist military junta getting rid of the Muslim Brotherhood because their main interest is stability in the region. A junta, incidentally, that I'm sure Harris and fellows like that have a lot of sympathy for because, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is terrifying. Again, I know that Harris will say the Muslim Brotherhood, he recognizes they're different than ISIS, they're different than Al-Qaeda, blah, 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 concentric circles. But the reality is there's still sweeping, broad claims about the nature of Islam and Muslim politics, which doesn't take into account these broader regional, strategic, and geographic questions, which are really the core drivers. Now, that's the sort of first set of points. Now, let's get to specific examples. Sam Harris has supported torture. In the End of Faith, he talked, and I'll quote directly, quote, "Given the damage that we are willing to cause the bodies and minds of innocent children in Afghanistan and Iraq, our disavowal of torture in the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed seems perverse. If there is even a chance in a 1 in a million that he would tell us something under torture that would lead to the further dismantling of Al-Qaeda, it would seem we should use every means at our disposal to get him talking." That's the End of Faith, page 198. Now, look, so that's an advocacy of torture. Now, people have said he's never advocated that. That's a direct, that's him saying it. Now, he's using a ticking time bomb, highly narrow scenario and contrasting it with actions in Afghanistan and Iraq, which he himself acknowledges causes massive civilian casualties, even though he was a strong supporter of the war in Afghanistan and, at the very least, highly ambiguous on Iraq, and we'll get to that soon. Now, there's nothing unique about that argument. That's the same basic logic that the torture program was run under, which is that, yes, this group, Dick Cheney, the 1% doctrine, we need to switch the burden of proof on torture from, and national security generally, from focusing on things that are likely and things that are apparent and causing responses to the 1% doctrine. If there is even a 1% chance or less that a catastrophic event could happen because of a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, then we need to take the gloves off. Torture, secret wars, all of the rest of policy that we've implemented into the war on terror era. Now, again, you can agree or disagree with that. I happen to profoundly disagree with that on a number of levels, including of which we've actually seen that traditional interrogation techniques favored by the FBI have worked better than torture. That's the practical, real-world reason for opposing it. We also have strong moral objections to torture. Sam Harris's argument, even though he's using a fun philosophical trick, and he goes on to talk about the ticking time bomb, which is a profoundly rare incidents. That's not how policy is designed, okay? This isn't 24. We live in the real world. That's the same logic adopted by the CIA, Dick Cheney, and the Bush administration. He's not using some special secularist logic to advocate for this policy. It's the same thing. Now, agree or disagree, but don't say I'm misrepresenting his position. He's saying there are extraordinary conditions under which torture is justified. I'm saying empirically we see it doesn't work. Empirically, the program was systemic and massive, and he does, and then that's where he goes to, well, I'm a philosophy writer, and I'm not writing about, and he's very sneaky. But there's a direct policy implication of that argument, and that policy implication is an umbrella for a mass torture program, which I object to morally, legally, and from a policy perspective. You can answer that, great. Number two, he's advocated for profiling Muslims. Now, Sam Harris makes this point in his response to controversy post that, of course, he is personally opposed to racism from people of Pakistani, Somali, and other descents of people with large Muslim populations. But then in the same argument that he made that profiling can be justified, he said, look, we need to, as a matter of practical policy, be profiling people that fit a jihadist profile, whatever the hell that means.
Well, we know it.
We know what that means. Exactly. As Matt said, we know what that means. So again, what are the practical ramifications of that in terms of the real world implications of profiling? Those same people that he objects, he says he has no racial problem with, are going to bear the burden of a policy that monitors them and profiles them at airports. Again, that's the reality. That's the real world consequence. So even as he's squirrely about it, and that's another column that he said, oh, I shouldn't have written it. It wasn't worth all the grief I've taken, and liberals are taking me out of context, blah, 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 blah. Again, as a guy who's always ranting about the real world consequences of beliefs, which he takes to on a profoundly literalist and simplistic level, the real world consequences of his thought experiments are the systemic harassment of certain populations, which we've already seen in things like the NYPD surveillance of Muslim communities across New York City. These are the real world consequences of what he's advocating. This is another important point, because when we're talking about Muslim populations, again, I apologize to do this to you, but we have to make, again, geographic distinctions here, okay? Those same Pew polls that he's always going on about that might show certain attitudes in certain Middle Eastern countries show very different attitudes in South Asian countries, show profoundly different attitudes amongst Muslims in Eastern Europe. Now, again, bringing it close to home, let's make another distinction. In Europe, there are distinctions in Muslim communities immigrating to Europe. And again, Muslim communities have been victims of very far right-wing politics in Europe, which Harris, again, even as he said he does not support fascist parties in Europe, but they're the only ones that have been willing to speak about with moral clarity about the Muslim threat. So just index that as well. It's another thing he'll squirrel out of, but he did write that. Muslim communities in Europe are in many cases, again, people who are attempting to build new economic lives for themselves, new social lives. Their attitudes track with many social norms in Europe, but there are certain communities and areas of difficulty in terms of accepting some of the norms of these countries. Again, multiculturalism goes both ways. There's a racial dynamic to the rise of anti-immigrant parties. And there are legitimate questions in certain Muslim communities about responding to and fitting with some of the norms in European societies. It's a very complex issue, nothing that's going to be answered, again, by a one-size-fits-all silly and bigoted view of Islam, and also something that's not going to be answered by denying that in certain cases there aren't some problems. In America, the Muslim population in America is profoundly integrated with a broader American mosaic. There's low levels of extremism. Their social attitudes track with other American populations. American Muslims, from a practical policy perspective, are another part of this country trying to survive in today's economy, in today's world. Every poll bears that out. So again, where there is the most immediate policy and social consequence of this kind of broad, simplified, fear-mongering belief about Islam, the broadest consequence of that is empowering, in an American context, Sharia conspiracy theorists, harassment of Muslim kids at high schools, and a politics of fear completely non-borne out by any facts in the American context. The European context, slightly more complicated, but again, no answers. In the Middle Eastern context, again, you want to go through the hard process of rooting out these policies. Simply running around and shouting that people's holy book is terrible and their founder of their faith was a child molester is not likely to root out ISIS, let alone explain ISIS. But that's a conversation for another day. Now I'll give you to the final point. You have to talk about Israel. Sam Harris, through basically quoting the Hamas charter, has turned the conversation into Israel into the same simplistic, delusional conversation he's turned everything else in, which is that Israel, even though, again, in the real terrestrial empirical world, is a regional power, no one else in the region could possibly approach Israel militarily. A country that has presided over a 40-year occupation, a siege on Gaza, and a country with a massive domestic appetite for right-wing expansionist politics. Again, not rooted. I mean, look, the Shas party, yes, there's ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. They're somewhat of a problem. But there's also a lot of actually religiously active Jews who are quite concerned about human rights. The core driver of these policies in Israel is right-wing nationalism, which is a far more dangerous problem in that conflict and in domestic Israeli politics than anything else. I don't see Sam Harris worrying about right-wing nationalism. But again, he quotes the Hamas charter. And the Hamas charter says absolutely horrible things about Jewish people, and it's terrible. And Hamas has engaged in acts. I'll make that distinction. I won't call Hamas a terrorist organization, but they have engaged in acts. Certainly, I consider suicide bombings and rockets that target innocent civilians acts of terrorism. I also consider dropping white phosphorus on civilian populations, bulldozing people's homes, collective punishment, detaining children, wanton disregard for civilian casualties, I consider those profound human rights violations, all of which Israel has regularly engaged in. But once you take the debate to this simplistic formula and level of abstraction where Hamas, which is absolutely a group that you can condemn, but like the IRA, you can do business with and must do business with, and indeed have done business with. There have been backdoor negotiations between Israel and Hamas, between the United States and Hamas, Europeans directly with Hamas. Their objection is rooted in a political and geographic fact of dispossession and occupation. Those are real world conditions. You think tomorrow that if the Palestinians all of a sudden said, hey, we want marriage equality and feminism, that all of a sudden they would say, oh yeah, and while you're at it, you know what? Keep control of our land and don't let us have freedom of movement. And the response he would say is that if Palestinians did that, Israel would happily give them a state. That's a completely fatuous and disingenuous argument that completely misunderstands the power dynamics of the situation and the political logic that leads to occupation. You think that people who advocate for greater Israel don't see their own reasons for, first of all, satisfying the demands of vital new voter blocks who get free land, subsidized housing, and all sorts of other massive benefits from living in occupied areas. You don't think that there's a massive political appetite and political constituency around all of the economics that keep the occupation going and keep the siege going. This is the problem when you don't look at real issues and real conditions on the ground. And incidentally, you can have the same stupid perspective and say, well, you know, if you read the Torah says Jewish people are chosen people, so therefore Israel does this, so therefore I understand everything about Israel. Great. That's really going to get you somewhere. It's not. That's another vital example of why this simplistic text reading is robbing you of the solutions and the critiques and the stands that everybody needs to take to solve one of the most intractable and dangerous situations in the world today, while dehumanizing a group of people that is already literally robbed of their rights and identity on a daily basis. Final point. You're right. Sam Harris, I don't know. Sam Harris said, with regards to Iraq, and this is again quoting him, that he said, I have never known what to think about the war. That's fine, okay? In the End of Faith, the main part of the section dealing with Iraq was to defend the morals of George W. Bush from Noam Chomsky and to do a long abstracted case about the moral validity of invading Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein. I have no doubt that if the invasion had gone successfully, Harris would say he supported it. It hasn't gone successfully, so now he thinks more ambiguously about it. And of course, the biggest problem in the invasion, in addition to bad planning, which everybody acknowledges, but it was not de-Baathification, it wasn't privatizing the whole country, it wasn't destroying any remnants of the attempts to form independent labor unions, the secular left, and other things that Harris would supposedly care about in an Iraqi context. No, it was that bad planning, and of course the Bush administration underestimated the sectarian tensions between Muslims in Iraq, because obviously those things explain everything, because Muslims are, bloodthirsty and irrational. Now, again, we've explained countless times on the show, and if you talk to someone like Vijay Prashad, who actually understands the region, who actually has studied the region, who actually has lived there, who actually knows politics, who actually knows geography, who actually knows resource conflicts, they will explain to you that the sectarian divisions are, first of all, connected with myriad other divisions, tribal divisions, district divisions, and really connected essentially to patronage systems. It wasn't just like, oh, under Saddam, the Sunnis are treated great because they're Sunni. They're connected to patronage networks that get jobs, that get delivery of services. The flip side, with de-Baathification, the Shia clique has done the same thing to the Sunnis in post-Saddam Iraq. I'm not saying, again, that sectarian conflicts and people's religious convictions are completely disconnected from this. But it is, again, is not the core driver. So look, I fully expect that people who are committed disciples, and Sam Harris is their guru, are going to write in, and I am, and I misrepresented this, and da-da-da-da. And look, I'm not writing a book on Sam Harris, and Sam Harris is very clever, and he adds a lot of caveats. And it is, again, ironic, as many people have noted, that for a guy who's constantly saying we should be just basing our understanding of the world on literalist text reading of holy texts, and that should be our main takeaway, particularly in some of the most politically volatile and economically complex places in the world, it is interesting that for a guy who says that, he claims to be taken out of context a whole hell of a lot by a whole hell of a lot of people. But if you have any open-mindedness, you want to track down those quotes, and you want to actually study context, I would advise you to do so. And that's the final word on Sam Harris for a little while. I mean, I don't read YouTube comments, so I guess this doesn't even matter in terms of that. But, I know the tweets will come, and look, some people relate to Sam Harris like a guru, like an infallible guru, the irony of which is just never lost on me and always amusing to me. And I know people who like certain aspects of what Sam Harris say, and they're able to easily distinguish that from incredibly problematic and wrong things that he says. And I find it kind of disturbing that it seems like the main people that engage on his behalf online are unable to do that. Now, the argument with Noam Chomsky is basically they're speaking in two different worlds. And the main point that just comes through again and again and again is that Sam Harris does not understand politics, and he does not understand international relations at all. And his argument is that Noam Chomsky does not take into account intention when he evaluates the actors in political atrocities or terrorism. So Noam Chomsky looks at things in a very quantitative and very clear way. And he'll say, look, if you lob a missile haphazardly at a site, and your intention is to not kill a whole bunch of civilians, but you're perfectly aware that this is going to happen, and you have mass firepower to do it, and you're doing it for any number of reasons. I will say also, without getting into this separate conversation, I don't agree with Noam Chomsky's assessments of why things always happen in foreign policy either, but that's for another day. At least, again, I disagree with Noam Chomsky sometimes, but Noam Chomsky is a leading authority in this stuff, and his conversation is taking place in the real world. Sam Harris will turn around and say, well, what's really going on is that U.S. and Western foreign policy makers are always making policy essentially and mostly with the highest of motive. Now, I can already see that I'm sure that Sam Harris has laid some markers somewhere that complicates that view. So he'll say, well, generally, of course, the United States, it was terrible what they did supporting Pinochet in Chile. So I'm no apologist for U.S. foreign policy, okay? I'm sure he'll throw a marker like that down. But fundamentally, his view is that even something like the invasion of Iraq, which may have been a huge mistake, according to what day it is for him, was done in a spirit of genuinely trying to improve the world. That was the intention. Now, again, I think if that's really your view of the decision-making behind the invasion of Iraq, that's delusional. Secondly, as Chomsky would point out, in addition to it being delusional, who cares if the result is disastrous? But the second and more problematic point, in my view, that Harris didn't even attempt to get to with Chomsky because Chomsky kept laying out the numbers and saying, let's talk about this. And Sam Harris would hit back with some sophomore year philosophy thought experiment that didn't answer the question. And that was why it got frustrating to read. But the other thing is that Harris will always say that civilian casualties and the humanitarian byproducts of interventions in the Middle East or South Asia by the United States are always essentially going to be boiled down to Muslims being barbarians. So Iraq, why did it fall apart? Not because we waged an illegal invasion and bombed the infrastructure and dissolved, and got rid of everybody who played a role in the civil service and had a disastrous privatization schemes and had no plans for governance, no reasons to go in to begin with. No. The reason is simply because Shia and Sunnis have this ancient tribal hatred, which again, as I've explained on this show, is incredibly simplistic. It's not like just, well, I have a different religious view than you. That's an aspect of it, but there's patronage networks. There's systems of economy and distribution. Ironically, all of the real-world terrestrial concerns that Sam Harris claims to be obsessed with never enter his thinking or barely register. So for a guy who claims to be very empirically driven and fact-based, he never looks at the most relevant empirical factors on the ground, which are economic and political and power distribution. So then what he'll say is it's like this horrible self-reinforcing loop, which is that, we do stuff even if it's a mistake for the best of motives. It works out poorly because Muslims, by and large, are irrational barbarians, which then, of course, reinforces some of the thought processes that lead to stupid policy. And then we go to the next cycle. And I just want to add one more point just to get this out, and then I'll finish. He also has accused people on the left and people that critique him of not standing in solidarity with Muslim moderates and Muslim activists on the ground in places like Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, who are working on behalf of human rights, who are working on behalf of women's rights. And, he's right about some of these things, okay? There's no postmodern justification for the treatment of women in a place like Saudi Arabia. There's no doubt that obviously religious fanaticism of any kind leads to a lot of human suffering. But he then slides and says, well, Eiynah Mohammed Ali is a representative of this Muslim voice on the ground. Look, Eiynah Mohammed Ali has a traumatic background. I in no way question her biography or where she's coming from, although, other people may wish to do so. That's not my interest. But the reality is that she is a Western pundit. That's her job now. She lives in D.C. or New York.
Well, she's kind of a fraud, too.
And she travels the world talking about Muslims in blanket ways and advocating horrific policies in war. She's a Western pundit. She's not a civil rights activist on the ground. She's not someone who's working for the rights of women in Pakistan. She's not a reformer in Iran. She's not Mir Hussein Mousavi, who's still in house arrest. She's not Mehdi Korobi, who's still in house arrest. None of these people register in the conversation. So Sam Harris basically has this sort of stunning naivete when it comes to our foreign policy, fused with a relentless one-dimensional view of Islam and Muslims, which lead to disastrous policies. And then he backs up and he says, well, wait, I'm the one who really supports Muslim activists, except never the ones who are actually working on the ground in these situations, dealing with the dead bodies, dealing with the undermining of feminist movements because of reckless drone policies. And then he sits back and then he pushes this to, unfortunately, all too often, a tremendously smug and self-satisfied and incredibly uninformed audience to reinforce their one-dimensional worldview about places they've never been to and things they have little to no understanding of. So that's my basic spiel. And it was embarrassing. I mean, again, agree or disagree, Noam Chomsky's just at a different level. It's just not, they're not in the same realm.
This guy who emails us, is there a lot of Islamophobia and bigotry directed at Muslims unfairly? Yes. Does that mean Sam Harris is a bigot because he criticizes the ideas of Islam? No. And talks about the numbers of subscribers to those ideas? No. But that's not where he stops.
Right.
Please stop straw manning Sam Harris. You are not accurately representing his positions. It's character assassination. And for what? The ideas of the Quran? How about the fact that Dan Carlin thinks the U.S. shouldn't even intervene to prevent genocide? So let's just adopt his non-interventionist viewpoint. Well, look, I disagree, although I think his point is definitely worth arguing as to whether or not any of our interventions ever work out well. But I think my position on this in terms of the UN and whatnot is well established. But here's what's not dangerous about Dan Carlin's call for non-intervention in all situations, if that's really what he's doing. No groups are going to be spied upon. I mean, I don't know if you heard that story about the Fort Dix 5, but there are 2 guys in prison for life, leaving behind about 8 kids for nothing. Sam Harris isn't directly responsible for that, but he creates an environment where that is possible, where nobody gives a crap. And I can assure you, it would be different if those guys were not Muslim. I can assure you it would be different.
And then another point that I've kept trying to emphasize is that it's also just as basic as even if you take these problems seriously, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or something, having an accurate representation of these groups specifically necessitates not having a blanket, generalized understanding of one religion in one part of the world. And when you get, like, at ISIS, we talked about those documents that Der Spiegel reported on, how a lot of the funding behind that group is really ex-Ba'athist intelligence officers, how that has a lot to do with reconstituting power structures in Iraq. And you can just say again and again and again that it's straw manning or it's unfair. But all I've ever said about Sam Harris is I've said he does make blanket generalizations and overstatements, and he supports policies that makes the problem worse. And he ignores, all the things that you just outlined that I don't need to mention again. And no one seems to be able to dispute that. And the last thing I want to just say, too, I think it's amazing.
But Dan Carlin is an interventionist, a non-interventionist.
Yeah, no, and that's really dangerous. But the last thing, too, is that Sam Harris has been writing books for, about 10, 15 years, and he writes in English for a kind of generally educated audience. And apparently understanding him is basically impossible, and there's many interpretations of this guy's writing. But the Quran, of who I'm sure almost none of these people writing in speaks Arabic or has ever studied this in any type of academic setting.
Easy peasy.
Easy. No challenge there. A couple thousand-year-old religious text interpreted by over 1 billion people across the entire globe. Pretty straightforward. But Sam Harris's, airport reading on atheism,
tough
that's a hard road.
Yeah.
Give me a fucking...
People are assessing what certain Muslim people do without a historical context in which that vision of Islam is being used. I mean, can you maybe expand on what I've said and make it a little more clear, I guess, for folks?
Well, you've made it very clear. The fact is that first of all, often the Quran is not very well translated, and people then don't know anything about its context. At one point Jesus says, "I haven't come to bring peace; I've come to bring a sword." And if people who didn't like Christianity could quote that and say, "Look, those Christians are about murdering people." That's the kind of thing that people do to the Quran and to Muslims. So the Quran talks about the pagan, militant pagans who were trying to kill the Muslims as infidels. It never uses that word as a noun for Jews or Christians. And then it says that when those pagans come for you, defend yourself with lethal force if you have to. So then people will read that, and it says, slay the infidels. So then they allege that the Muslims want to go around just killing random people, which is, completely ahistorical and not what the Quran or the Muslim community believes at all. People like Sam Harris, who've made careers out of spreading hate against Muslims, have excerpted poorly translated versions of those verses and tried to make them mean something that they don't.
And one of the things that I think Sam Harris also likes to quote and to in his argument that there's something fundamentally wrong with Islam is the Hadith. What is the Hadith? What is the relationship of the Hadith to the Quran, and what of that practice of someone like Sam Harris's?
Yes, well, that's a complicated issue because mainstream Sunni Islam is a little bit like Orthodox Judaism in the sense that you have the Bible and then you have the Talmud. And both are adhered to as strictly as possible. And so with the Muslims, there's a big amount of material that grew up after the Prophet's death, which is sayings and doings which are attributed to him by later generations. Those were collected, and people tried to winnow through them and decide which ones were sound. But there's a vast amount of material of that sort. So, in my view, as a Western academic, it's clearly contradictory to the Quran itself. But there are, thousands of these sayings and doings attributed to the Prophet and his companions, which some of them can be picked out and used for polemical purposes.
I mean, that is the point, right? I mean, and that's what we talk about historical context, is that throughout the past 1,500 some odd years, different political entities have wanted to gain the authority of Islam as a mechanism in which to rule or to shape the politics of their day. And so they reinterpret the religion or the document in ways that suit that political agenda.
That's right. And of course, this is a universal phenomenon.
Right. I mean, this is like the kings saying, this is like the king, of England saying, like, I'm here because God wanted me to be.
Exactly. Or Pope Urban II, who strongly believed that Christians were commanded by the New Testament to go to the Holy Land and slit the throats of the Jews and the Muslims. Religion can be used for these political purposes. And then the whole tradition of the religion can be deployed in various ways. So, again, in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, after the Roman Empire became Christian, Christianity was the state religion, and gradually no other religion was allowed. And the interpretation of the New Testament by the Byzantine kings was that, pagans should be killed. They threw them to the lions. They kind of reversed what had happened to them earlier on. To make this about Christianity as opposed to Byzantine policy would be invidious. It would be unfair, and likewise, a lot of the polemic against Islam is about what Muslims have done in history, which has been both good and bad, as they're human beings.
What, both from an academic and I guess more from a human perspective, do you hope to achieve?
Well, I began this project with an open mind, and I had been trained in my youth in Islamics, and had wanted to go back to it for some time. And, the post 9/11 atmosphere was such that at my blog I would get involved in conversations with my readers about the Quran and about Islam. And I began to see that it just wasn't well understood. It wasn't understood as I understood it. But then I also had some puzzles to work through in the text and in the history. So some years ago, I began working on this in what passes for my spare time, and I tried to read as much as I could about the late Roman context of all of these things, and then to trace through these themes in the Quran. And often I was surprised. I was surprised by how much emphasis there was on peacemaking in the Quran, and how few, verses there are. It's said that the Prophet Muhammad was involved in these defensive wars for 6 afternoons in his life, and he probably died at 63. So most of it is about community making and peacemaking. And I felt that since the Prophet Muhammad is being demonized so much by Islamophobic forces, both in the United States and Europe now, that a solid explication of his life as it is told by the Quran itself, which I take as my primary source, was really needed.
Has Sam Harris ever reached out to you for, to engage you in your expertise on this subject? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, no. I think Sam thinks he knows it all. He doesn't know Arabic and isn't really, trained in religious studies. So much of what he says is just glib polemics.
He practices kind of like vaccination through writing. So he'll say, like, as an example, with one extremist, he'll say, and this is why he always whines that he's taken out of context. He'll say, like, it would be absolutely unthinkably horrible to nuke the Middle East. But, however, here's a thought experiment. I know this one. Right? And then on the other extreme, what he'll say is of course politics matters, of course history matters, of course all that matters. I don't ever want to talk about that but I will acknowledge that it exists so as to get back to my main primary focus, which really is, in his case, is that, the Quran's a super bad book and it leads to super bad things. That's his main point. And it's sort of pathetically unconvincing, and it's more disturbing that people follow him, frankly.
Okay. Here's the thing. I did hear one thing that he said. He was talking about the Hindu caste, the caste system in India, and how it'd be undeniable that has a link back to the doctrine of Hinduism.
That's
right?
actually a great example. That's a great example of not doing so. If you were studying that in an academic setting, first of all, you already have to distinguish like at least 3 different tracks in that conversation. So number one, if you want to understand the caste system historically, of course that has something to do with the ideology of the caste system, which again is not all of Hinduism. That's a pretty amorphous term. But if you really understood it, the base of the caste system comes from economics. It comes from economic decision making. Let me finish. It's economics, which is justified through ideology. So if you're looking at the world from my perspective, again, it's much more profitable to look back at the root structure of what leads to things. The second point would be, of course, Hinduism played a role in Indian anti-colonial struggle, and many Hindus were virulently opposed or wanted to deeply reform the caste system. Then you had a guy like Ambedkar, who wrote the Indian Constitution and was a major anti-colonial leader, who converted to Buddhism because it was anti-caste, but was still fiercely identified with Indian tradition. And this is what I mean that Sam Harris does, is he takes an alluring truism that's really actually obvious and doesn't really shed that much light on anything, and then uses that to evade a much more complicated conversation, which isn't about like being, PC or whatever. It's about actually figuring things out. And if you don't have, it's like eating a big meal with no nutrition in it. Like you think you're gotten somewhere, but all you have that's worthwhile is totally obvious and nobody would dispute. And then the other part you have actually leads you down some pretty right-wing and stupid roads, and that's the problem with him. What he says that's right is obvious.
It doesn't exactly lead you. It doesn't lead you to a right-wing foreign policy, as in like
Well, it certainly leads him to one. It certainly leads him to one.
But it just understand that that the system that they'll have is that it's unjust, and we should. That they should try and advance in a direction that will lead them away from that. Like in why is that this is the other part of the conversation, right? There's some groups that do human rights, like I would think a group like Amnesty International. Some people have criticisms of them, but Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they are just committed to human rights, period. So whether they're dealing with oppression of Dalits in India, or they're documenting us bombing civilians in Yemen, or they're documenting the Chinese executing political prisoners or occupying Tibet, or the Israelis killing Palestinian civilians or Palestinian terrorists killing, all of that, they're committed to documenting human rights. The problem, again, with someone like Harris is that he's not a human rights advocate. He's using human rights in specific situations. On religious doctrine and how it, and how
his understanding of religious doctrine would not pass muster in any academic setting. So he's focused on using a human rights conversation to not forward human rights, but to demonize a particular group and then use it as an excuse for, again, policies like drones, which are in fact a violation of human rights. So if you you think he has kind of a white man's burden kind of? Yeah, he has a white man's burden. He also just doesn't understand. He doesn't he's supposedly a neuroscientist, and I wouldn't go and write columns on neuroscience and say that other neuroscientists he writes about topics and comments grandiosely on topics that clearly he really does not have an understanding of. And then because he speaks in this very guru-like way and with this kind of seductive pseudo-sophistication, he builds a cult around him of people who mimic his every stupid utterance on social media. And the truth, again, as I say, what he says is true is obvious. And then what he says is a problem is a real problem. There is no one in the world that would deny that, ISIS is a problem or religious fundamentalism is a challenge. The question is, how do you actually deal with it? And how do you actually figure it out? And he's got nothing. I'm sorry, but this is the problem. So he's using a thought experiment which leads to especially in the context of when he wrote it. He was writing it at a time in 2003, 2004, when there was, there were people inside the administration that were open to using tactical nukes as an example. So he's writing it in a real policy climate, and he uses this silly evasion. And then the reality is that in the real world, who has nukes that is a Muslim state that could possibly even remotely be close to this ideology that he's supposedly describing? Because the only group that might function the way right. So exactly. So Pakistan's leadership is not going to and they're not going to right. And I'll explain. They're not going to launch a preemptive nuke strike against anyone. The danger in Pakistan is the logistics of their in terms of reality. Now, India and Pakistan both tested. In fact, India tested first, and then Iran just signed a breakthrough deal with us. So this is what I mean. This is why you got to actually look at policy, and this is why all of this stuff is just fantasy life, and it's not real, and it leads to dangerous ideas. But I got to jump.
This is from a podcast in 2016, Polite Conversation podcast. It's Sam Harris being interviewed, I guess, by Eiynah Mohammed. Is that her name?
Yeah, Eiynah Mohammed. Polite Conversation started as, she was sort of like on this new atheist type of thing. She's I think from Pakistan, and she's been sort of like, she's been censored by religious authorities herself, so she was sort of like kind of on that side of things. But this is about where the split with her and sort of Sam Harris comes from. Where
is that right?
Yeah. So this conversation happens with sort of her as a sort of like fan or previously a fan of Sam Harris.
Yeah. So anyways, here's Sam Harris in conversation with Eiynah Mohammed, and she is basically, you can almost hear the sort of like, she's hoping for him to say the right thing. And by right thing, I mean just like the humane thing. And he doesn't.
And I have been so happy because, my following of Sam Harris is sometimes like a roller coaster. Then one day there's like, this interview with Anne Marie Waters is good. And I'm like, oh no, Sam.
Well, that's another example. So that's the only thing I've ever seen from Anne Marie Waters.
But you see why then Gad and Reuben are doing some harmful things, because they're presenting these people in the best light possible.
Okay, pause it. So let me just catch you up on this conversation. So she sees Sam Harris tweet out, this conversation with this Anne Marie Waters is interesting and good. And she says that's problematic because she's a bad person. And Harris is like, well, but that's all I've seen of hers. And then she says, well, that's a perfect illustration of why Dave Rubin, and was it Saad God she's talking about, are so bad and toxic, because they take this person who has been called a Nazi and racist by the UKIP party in Britain, and make her seem palatable to people like you. And then theoretically, you amplify this person in a positive light even more. And so you've got Eiynah Mohammed here trying to say, like, don't you see this is the problem? When they charge you with being some type of gateway to the alt-right, this is exactly how you're doing it. And you cannot, it's not enough. And she's now taking the tack, like, it's not enough to say that just you're ignorant about this person. That you are.
Well, ironically, it's the whole context thing. Sam Harris says, I shouldn't need any extra context for this person. I should just be able to judge it purely off of this one interview with Dave Rubin. I mean, Jesus.
presenting these people in the best light possible.
Okay, but do you agree? You watched that interview, right? Do you agree that she came off? I mean, she basically sounded like me or Douglas or someone. I mean, Douglas.
I
my
didn't
version
watch
of Douglas.
the interview, but I just
pause it. So
I know
his defense is, but in that narrow context, she was good. So you cannot. So he is purposely evading the point she's trying to make. The point she's trying to make is that you cannot present this person. This is what's problematic. You're presenting a person as so good when you're not doing any research on him and you're just relying on Dave Rubin. And so Dave Rubin is problematic because he's taking someone who is also not good and is selling it to you. And so his defense is like, well, but, you know, I didn't know, you know, it's like buying, like, the guy showed up and he said he's got a bunch of fur coats that fell off the back of I had no idea it was stolen goods, right? I mean, that's basically it. Like, you can't blame me for that, even though I'm a scholar. But go ahead.
And I know that she thinks if you're not anti-immigration, as she said to me and Mariam Namazi, then you're pro the rape of white women.
Right, but again,
and she heads this organization called Pegida with Tommy and with a white genocide guy called Paul Weston, I believe. And Paul Weston is a guy who thinks that no Muslims should ever be allowed to hold public office, even Muslims like Majid Nawaz. And they're all heading this pro-freedom, supposedly, organization, which is clearly contradictory because they're not pro.
So she is now telling him this person's pedigree. She is working with people who are, talking about white genocide. She's working with people, officially working with people, who say that Muslims can't hold office. She's working, I think Tommy, is that a reference to...
Tommy Robinson.
Yes, who is like an avowed white supremacist. And so this is all, problematic stuff. Listen to how Harris responds to this. It's fascinating.
Freedom. Tommy talks about deporting Muslims. Paul Weston doesn't want them to be able to hold public office. Anne Marie thinks you're pro-rape of white women if you're not anti-immigration or prepared to let rape happen. And she thinks that.
But the problem, I mean, again, this is an area where we're in. This is a gray area in the sense that, she's right. When you look at what's happened in Europe in the last 12 months, you have a lot of people on the left who are prepared to let white women get raped by Muslim immigrants. I mean, there are people who are prepared to be raped themselves. I don't know if you heard.
What?
Did you hear the story of the woman who got raped by 3 refugees or 3 non-German speaking migrants? And when she reported this rape, she was so afraid to spark racial tension that she claimed she was raped by 3 German men. And then like 48 hours later, she recanted it, and she described them accurately. But that's But then
there's another story of a German girl.
Now wait a second. She's going to go back and forth with the story, but like to cite an anecdote like that, as the public intellectual that this guy pretends to be, to cite an anecdote like that, let's just assume and stipulate it's true. I don't know if it's true or not, but let's just assume it's true. To cite an anecdote and say that the left is pro-rape of white women if they're allowing immigrants in, or are prepared to be pro, whatever that means. To use that one example and to tarnish an entire political ideology with that is just absurd. It's absurd. To posit that you are some type of public intellectual and to make those pronunciations, that is a guy who is afraid of losing his audience. That's the best thing I can say about that. Continue.
That's
one. But then there's another story of a German girl who made up a story about being raped by Muslim immigrants when she wasn't.
But what no one it
Pause
seems
it. Sure, that happens. That one anecdote, though, shouldn't by the same reasoning, shouldn't that tarnish all white people who get raped? Like, so you are necessarily prepared. The rest of society is prepared for people to make up who they're raped by. I mean, this is absurd. This is a guy who's desperately flailing around trying to protect some image. And you got to ask yourself, why? You know, people ask, like, why I used to call this guy a charlatan. This is why.
Sam Harris is, for a guy who constantly whines, is a sort of strategically disingenuous person who is constantly giving himself escape routes and different ways of coding or evading or not actually strictly standing by the implications of what he's saying. And for good reason. I understand that Sam Harris opposes the Muslim ban. I have no idea how anybody could read and take seriously his musings on Islam and not support a Muslim ban. That would be the logical conclusion, in my view, of reading and taking anything he says seriously. In fact, as I've seen from Sam Harris, who has rightly opposed Trump pretty much every step of the way, some of his audience is shocked that he's not followed his own natural conclusions. So maybe there are a couple of people in a small subgroup of new atheists who switch over to vote for neo-fascists because they don't hear enough anti-Muslim bigotry from mainstream Democratic and labor politicians. Look, it's really simple. There is a very easy answers to these questions, not in terms of implementing policy-wise, but as an intellectual framework. Foreign policy matters, culture, context, and history matters, and ideology matters. If you're primarily concerned about ideology, you don't look to Islam as one thing. You certainly don't look to your own reading of the Hadith and the Quran, especially if you don't even speak Arabic and have no training in this area, as a one-size-fits-all answer to this. You can focus on the role of funding a very specific and virulent strain by certain members of the Gulf states who happen to have very close relationships with Western governments. These are complicated issues. They're important issues. And even if you're not doing it intentionally, if you're out promoting hysterical, ahistorical, pseudo-intellectual views about this, you are at the very least the unwitting handmaiden of some incredibly dangerous and cruel policies that are happening right now in the United States and across the globe. But I hope anybody who takes these things at all seriously and would like to do a little bit of work besides listening to a couple of podcasts will get in, do some actual reading, do some actual research, because these areas actually are quite important and they demand that. Now, Sam Harris, this is the reason that I objected to all the anti-Muslim stuff. Again, it's not that you can't have a robust criticism of Islam or any religion as a doctrine if you choose to. It's not that we can't condemn and be serious about terrorism. It's not that we can't, and this is actually probably most important, have a for real foreign policy conversation about the Saudis and the Qataris and why a certain very narrow and actually very modern form of Islam is funded as an instrument of those places' foreign policies. And actually much of U.S. foreign policy, in fact, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria to some extent. Sam Harris didn't do that. Sam Harris went and had one-dimensional, highly condensed, straw man, bigot, and paranoia sessions about Muslims. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because it dumbed down foreign policy discourse and it hurt in the Western context, what is objectively a more vulnerable population, which is not to excuse everything about the religion or different beliefs, or not say that Muslim communities have to obviously be reciprocal in their relationship when they immigrate, as an example, to a Western country. But there's no doubt that between surveillance, oppression, counterterrorism policies, and monitoring, and just generalized, yes, racism, even though I know it's a religion, not a race, but the reality is that these are disproportionately people that come from backgrounds like the Middle East, South Asia. There's obviously a race component. To pretend otherwise is disingenuous. So not only was that an incredible problem in and of itself, and one that we will always fight if we're serious about preserving, in fact, open societies and the actual values that these people pretend to care about, it's also a problem because he's training people in a ahistorical, disconnected, nerdist, narrow way of looking at everything. This is why it shocked him that so many of his fans were Trump supporters. He was right about Trump. He knew Trump was a disaster. But he couldn't understand, because his limited understanding of politics and society is so breathtaking, why his own cult online, so many of them would find Trump to be appealing. And then why does that discourse start to get transferred into this neo-resurgence of Charles Murray and IQ myths and pseudoscience used to prop structural racism? You know, racism and bigotry in this country has never just been, or even solely or even primarily, the kind of instrument of this sort of hick stereotype that we have. You know, the only white racists are, you know, kind of dumb white people who are, you know, have Southern accents, they aren't educated, and, you know, this sort of Gomer Pyle stereotype. There has always been very well educated, very highly financially leveraged people who have used the means and discourse of quote unquote science and other mainstream, commonly accepted verbiage and cultural training, and again, quote unquote science, to prop and spread racism. What we need to have is a conversation not about a free and open exchange of ideas, but a conversation about where do ideas actually come from and who funds them. That's the serious thing. And if you're an actual journalist, you'd spend a lot less time worried about these silly cultural wars on one side or another, or dumb Twitter beefs, and look at who is funding this. We have a family like the Mercers who hold incredibly dangerous extremist beliefs about the economy, about race, about democracy, and they are willing to fund anyone in pursuit of those dangerous antithetical to democracy goals, and they help put this dangerous antithetical to democracy president in the White House. And if you can't get that that's what matters, and who funds it is what matters, and that the funding is more important than the quote-unquote ideas, you're not equipped to deal with our current political moment. Now, again, you know, this sort of neo-reactionary kind of wing and the Sam Harris thing would really want to kind of reassert that, like, no, you cannot subject IQ to any type of cultural critique. It's as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. But we know that anything, frankly, that isn't 2 + 2 = 4 always has cultural conditions and assumptions built into it. So that's number one. But also in some ways more interesting, but please elaborate on that too. What I'm understanding from your work is that even the original basis of how IQ was formed, or how IQ was created, was not thought of as a fixed property. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the IQ test was invented by a French psychologist and educator named Alfred Binet. And Binet's idea was that, you know, obviously kids are performing at different levels in different areas, and wouldn't it be great to have a test so that we could assess what their strengths and weaknesses were, so we could then come in as educators or as psychologists and provide them with the support to develop those areas of weaknesses. And what happened is that the IQ test was then hijacked by the eugenics movement. So these are all those guys who ultimately gave you things like, you know, Nazi eugenics policy. And it's worth noting where the eugenics movement came from. So Charles Darwin, after he published On the Origin of Species, his cousin, Francis Galton, who was an English aristocrat, reads this work, and then somehow the English aristocrat concludes that what Darwin's work really means is that some people are born better than others. And
right. How did that happen?
How did that happen? Yeah.
Right.
And so he publishes this book called Hereditary Genius. And, you know, he just goes out and shills this idea, and it just enters into the popular zeitgeist and leads to all sorts of things like forced sterilization, and, you know, I mean, yeah, all sorts of atrocities, basically. And Terman, you know, that idea, which is the basic idea, is that, you know, humans are, you know, if you can breed animals for certain properties, why not breed humans for certain properties? And why not eliminate certain people who don't fit what you want for your society? And so Terman hijacks Binet's test and turns it from a flexible property, a growth property, to intelligence being this fixed property. And even way back in 1909, Alfred Binet, the inventor of the IQ test, said, "Some recent philosophers seem to have given their moral approval to these deplorable verdicts that affirm that the intelligence of an individual is a fixed quantity, a quantity that cannot be augmented. We must protest and react against this brutal pessimism. We will try to demonstrate that it is founded on nothing." And, Carol Dweck, who's at Stanford, we had her on the Mixed Mental Arts podcast, and she describes her life's work as undoing the damage caused by Lewis Terman. The tragedy of that is that Carol Dweck's research has been around for 40 years. And so you have the eugenics movement, which was created 150 years ago, the IQ test, which was hijacked 100 years ago, and then Carol Dweck, who has been trying to undo that damage for 40 years. And this is the real price of scientists being such bad communicators, is that the evidence is long piled up without being communicated well. And then someone like Charles Murray comes along and provides these very provocative statistics that suck all the attention out of the room, and that those ideas just diffuse in much the same way that Francis Galton did with hereditary genius 150 years ago.
Right. So that's a brilliant, and it really does ground firmly. I mean, the reality is that Charles Murray is in that grotesque lineage. Now, from my sort of angle, I'm very interested in covering, the material realities that give rise to someone like Charles Murray. I mean, this is somebody whose most of his career has been subsidized by far-right think tanks, and it's been his job, whether he's pathologizing people culturally or genetically, to essentially write, and I'm not saying he's not sincere in his beliefs, but his job, his paycheck, is essentially dependent on writing justifications for not providing opportunities for people and universal social safety nets of any advanced society. What is the appeal culturally and emotionally, and maybe you can explain the kind of science of emotions, of this pseudo-certainty and dogmatism of a Sam Harris and Charles Murray about these things, which leads to these, these ideas are so destructive on the macro racist level that we're talking about, but they're also even destructive on individual student level who thinks they're stupid and can't grow. This has so many toxic effects.
The key thing that you said is that, people are looking to science to organize their lives. Why? Because this is a really uncertain time. All these, Katie O'Brien, who co-wrote The Straight A Conspiracy with me, she calls this moment in history humanity's first family dinner. And for most of human history, all the cultures of the world have been off in their little corners, and now we're all being shoved together at one table by globalization and the internet. And that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so, that was my childhood because I grew up all over the world moving between cultures. And what you want to do is you want to grab onto some sort of raft, something that you feel you can anchor on. And for me, it was science, because we have come to think of as science as the solid, reliable thing that we can plant a flag on. But the problem is that while we're looking to organize our lives with science, science itself is massively disorganized. So what that means is that, there are 60 million scientific papers, and then science itself is so siloed into academic disciplines that people don't talk to each other. So what happens is that, someone like Charles Murray will come along, they have their one statistic or their one set of statistics or, this one lens of looking at intelligence. And then if you are coming in already believing that there is a link between melanin and intelligence, well, now's the thing that you're going to grasp onto and run with. And that's the point. Is it's what we have going on is not that people are turning to science, it's that people are cherry picking the science that fits their existing prejudices.
For me, I have an analysis of the world, and of course I think it makes sense, and of course I think it's, rigorous and everything else, and I think that that's important. But there's no doubt that I wouldn't care about the issues that I care about and frame them as I do if I didn't have an experience of homelessness, as an example. And that's an emotional experience. So there's nothing wrong with that per se, but we do need to be transparent about that.
There's this idea, the word rationality is thrown around a lot, especially like by people like Charles Murray and Sam Harris. And what they use that word to mean is that they are somehow objective or uninfluenced by their emotions, and that they're impartial and only sift through the data. And that is actually not rationality, that's posing. And the core one is really that thinking and feeling are always linked. Right. And so anybody who is trying to pretend that their thinking is not being influenced by their feelings is intellectually dishonest. I mean, that's the great irony is that Sam Harris loves to call everybody intellectually dishonest because that's what he is. And you can't have intellectual honesty without emotional honesty. And so I think that we all have to start demanding that emotional honesty from anybody who's trying to purvey or sell a view of the world. But that's just, the Damasio's work. Like, there's also
Right.
Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. There's all of John Haidt's work on moral psychology and moral dumbfoundedness, and on and on and on and on and on. And the big problem is that, in order to appreciate that research, you have to do like real interdisciplinary work. You have to do go across lots of science. In reality, if you dig in on those statistics, for example, as Richard Nisbett, who also called out Charles Murray and Sam Harris, he has a book called Intelligence and How to Get It. And if you look at high-income families, because all this stuff, that 50% thing, it's all based on adoption studies. The
Right.
idea is, if you've got kids who have a particular genetics and then, they're twins, then they have the same genetics. And so if
Right.
they're raised in different environments, then you're purely measuring the effects of environment because you've controlled for genes because they're twins and they have the same genes.
Right.
But in practice, Nisbett found that if you have high-income kids, that essentially it's almost all genetics. It's 90% genetics and 10% environment. But on the other hand, if you have low-income kids, it's 10% genetics and 90% environment. So if you dig into those IQ results, then what you're going to find is that it actually points to the opposite conclusion socially that someone like Charles Murray and his funders at the American Heritage Foundation would support, which is that actually the rich should be giving more of their money to low-income families because that's where you're going to get the biggest IQ gains.
Right. Right.
So there's the picture that these guys try and paint. They try and declare that it is science, and anyone who challenges it is denying science. But actually, if you bother to dig around in the science, you'll find that the picture is quite different.
I'm trying to figure out where Stanhope went to high school. I used to know.
I mean, Rogan.
I think he went to the same high school as I did. I think
Rogan
he's a little
is
bit younger than I am.
Very, very emotionally attached to Harris.
Yes.
It's sort of like almost like Harris is like a Bond villain and Rogan's like his bodyguard.
There's
like Harris is in there doing like thought experiments and cooking stuff up in some like chair that was bestowed by the Golden Girls inheritance, and Rogan's like, "What do you need, boss?"
Is very problematic. And many people on the left think that when you criticize Islam, that you are some sort of a racist. You're akin to a racist. Whereas if you criticize Christianity, you're someone who's just not a rube. Right? It gets to that weird thing because of brown skin and people's desire to not be perceived as racist. So they go way overboard with it. And
which is what's happening with the Me Too thing, where you go, I see all the benefits of people coming out, and it's putting the fear in fucking everybody. Who did I fuck 20 years ago? Go
exactly.
ahead.
No, but I just wanted to so for Sam's sake, like, he's not a racist by any stretch of the imagination. He doesn't like ideologies. He doesn't like something that makes you think that God wants you to kill people. He doesn't want, I mean, whether or not you interpret that the way the Christians do, I mean, there's not a lot of people killing people over some shit from the fucking Old Testament. You know, there's no one out there enacting the rage of God for people wearing two different types of cloth, right?
Because...
All right, now pause it. Now here it is. Here it is. Just go back a second. Here is where exactly Doug Stanhope is going to address exactly the point that we have made on the show 1,000,000 times about Sam Harris's analysis, right? That Sam Harris says Islam is problematic. Stanhope goes with this retort as to why we don't see that same behavior out of Christianity.
Testament. You know, there's no one out there enacting the rage of God for people wearing two different types of cloth, right?
Because Christians are generally better off. And once you get a lot of fucking toys, and you dismiss a lot of that, I should kill myself in the name of blank.
That's a fucking good point.
Thank you.
Exactly.
That's
a great point. In fact, that is the point. that you happen to have cultures in Islam that have been, because of destiny, they had oil under the ground, and it has created an entire centuries of political machinations that have created these, whether it's propping up monarchies that are exploiting the resources, whether it's actually funding these nascent organizations of extremists because you're going to find advantage, they're going to fight your enemies. I mean, all of this. And so it is not that Islam is the problem. It is that Islam's problem was they had a lot of oil under the ground.
And that specific ideologies, as you were alluding to, are funded for very, very specific reasons. And even understanding the difference, as an example, between the Shiite revival and Iran Hezbollah, which I guess I always got to be clear even with these people, I do not endorse, but which did have a incredibly real world anti-imperialist political focus, which we reacted to, versus supporting the Saudis and Salafist and jihad in Afghanistan, which is a precursor to all of these problems, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because at the time they were perceived of as apolitical and just a religious revivalist movement, which is why, Reagan called them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. This stuff is all politics and economics. And what's so annoying about Harris is that, he might take a few people who good-naturedly, I think with good intentions, but they have a simplistic critique and they do just reduce all, like if you have a critique of Islam, it's just latent racism, which if we're being real, in some cases it obviously is. But what Harris does is he takes critiques of his view, which are actually just infinitely more sophisticated, and then tries to reduce it down to that because he can't confront those things because he's not informed enough, apparently. Which is his he's bad faith.
Whatever it is.
But that's his exchange with Chomsky.
But just looking, I want to ask you two things. I want to ask you, one, what was it that you found interesting or attractive or impressive about Sam Harris? And then what was it that made you realize, like, whoa, what?
Well, it was mostly the religious stuff, because I used to be religious, and a lot of his debates kind of, in books and stuff like that kind of turned me into an atheist. And I thought, he is a pretty good debater, but I just thought he was a little bit more intelligent than he was because of those debates. And, there's been a lot of things, but over the past, year and a half, I used to listen to his podcast, every episode, but I just started hearing him say more and more stupid shit. And he's so unbelievably shallow on everything outside of three topics. And the thing that just kind of put me over the tipping point was the Charles Murray thing. He painted all the criticisms of Charles Murray's book as just, political correctness gone, crazy. And and I'm not, some genius, but it took me 5 seconds to just Google Charles Murray and see that, yeah, there's a ton of legitimate criticisms of the book. And Sam seemed completely ignorant to any real criticisms, academic criticisms of it. And I just thought it was really stupid. If I can get on Google and the first thing I see is an academic criticism, but then I don't understand. I don't understand how you can be this ignorant to the criticisms of the book, especially considering he's a quote unquote neuroscientist.
Taking me out of context.
Yeah, I don't think it sounds to me like you don't possibly understand what he's saying.
Can I just say real quick, I think the thing with Harris, though, is I think that he might, especially relative to somebody like Rubin, who's obviously purely just an opportunist at best. I think Harris might believe in some of this stuff, but the thing that always bothered me about Harris was that, when he only just did middle school rants about religion and then had his obsession with Islam, which led him to flirt with all sorts of policies, which of course I know if I say he supported, I'm taking him out of context, blah, blah, blah. The thing that just struck me, though, is that his writing about Islam inevitably leads to embracing Charles Murray, because if you're so committed to excluding all historical, every other factor besides this incredibly narrow, attempted empirical reading, which isn't really empirical, then that's going to lead to a politics that doesn't ever acknowledge
again, anything historical or anything contextual. And that's like the right-wing project in a lot of ways.
What I hear Scott doing is discounting the role of specific beliefs. And I think it really matters specifically what people believe, and that there are innumerable instances where we can see that the proximate cause of certain behavior is precisely what a person believed, in this case about God and paradise and the evils of infidels. And so one thing I would say to you, Scott, is that you have some, if Islam is really orthogonal to this problem, or a variable number 10 on your list of variables, a few things you should explain. One is, where are the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers? There are, most of the Palestinians are Muslims, obviously, but there are Palestinian Christians who have to go through the same checkpoints. They suffer the same humiliations by Israelis. I mean, it seems to me this is practically a science experiment. We have the same people speaking the same language, living in the same deplorable conditions. One group rather reliably forms a death cult, and the other doesn't. And another example I'd like to put on the table: where are the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers? If oppression were enough to so derange a culture that they would blow themselves up on school buses, and where you could get crowds by the tens of thousands calling for the deaths of non-combatants, we would see Tibetan Buddhists blowing themselves up on Chinese school buses. And you can react to those two examples. And
yeah, good empirical claims. False.
This is a study by a colleague of mine who works with me on.
Could you have this is a study. This is a study by a colleague of mine who works with me on the evolution of religion. He is a logistic regression looking at the odds of scapegoating, which is highly correlated with dogmatism, inflexibility of belief, and commitment to violence among 10,000 people over 10,000 people in 10 countries around the world. And so you have Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, other Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, non-religious as atheists and agnostics, and others. Okay, this is the odds of scapegoating for people who believe there is only one God and it's my God, versus people who believe in God as a supernatural entity. Okay? Or people who believe that there is no difference. What we've got is, in terms of, no, I'm not going to show the rest of them. What we got is exclusivity, that is a tendency to scapegoating, is highest for Catholics, Orthodox, and atheists. Okay? It is lowest for Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. Okay, that's the only empirical evidence I know about sort of intrinsic notions, which a large sample size of scapegoating, and it's, as I said, it's virtually identical for violence and inflexibility of belief. Now, with respect to Palestinians, Buddhists, right? Well, Buddhists, there were Japanese Buddhists who were kamikaze, of course, and the Sri Lankan army actually is threatening to do suicide squads against the Tamil Tigers, who are Hindu suicide squads. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, you get about 70% support, depending on the threat perception at the moment. The surveys are done mostly by Khalil Shikaki of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. You get about 70% in a random sample among Christians for support for suicide terrorism, depending on threat perception. Now, the reason there aren't almost none, although Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades does allow Christians, the reason that...
Have there been Christian suicide bombers?
No.
Okay.
The reason that there isn't is because the particular groups that are formed are... Actually, there have been PFLP suicide bombers. Palestinian Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There have been 6 cases, I believe. There's some mostly Christian Marxist organization. The reason they have suicide bombers is very simple. And the reason Al-Qaeda has it is very simple. Suicide bombing, especially by Hamas operatives and Al-Qaeda operatives, are by their best and brightest. That is, the majority of suicide bombers are college educated, fairly well off relative to the surrounding populations, no desperation, poverty, no criminal backgrounds, no insanity, no suicidal tendencies. And the organizations make a very costly commitment, a sort of Zahavi handicapping principle, to use their best and their brightest to get the community to trust them and increase their political market share. And they've been so unbelievably successful that the PFLP, which is a secular Marxist organization, and the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, if you go to their websites, they're indistinguishable now from the Hamas. That is, you get incantations, almost Quranic. They're not Quranic, but they use the same words for sacrifice. And Al-Qaeda, the success of suicide bombing by Al-Qaeda is a very contingent affair, very similar to the Nazis, okay? There's a marvelous book called 30 Days. It's about Hitler's rise to power in January 1933. On January 1st, the major newspapers in Germany declared Hitler's party dead. He had lost 2 successive elections. By the end of the month, he's Chancellor of Germany through an unbelievably improbable set of events that no one would have predicted. And that takes over the fascist movement. Basically, it becomes the paragon of fascism around the world. Bin Laden, same thing. He was one of about 40 Mujahideen commanders. And he got this bright idea basically from a combination of the Hezbollah and the Tamil Tigers, used it effectively, created unbelievable theater. And that theater was inordinately successful at, again, it was a media-driven political awakening, at mobilizing consciousness among a vast number of people. And Islam had this characteristic. It is a messianic religion like Christianity, like all the monotheisms, and like all the isms, communism, anarchism, all the secular versions of Christianity. And it is a multi-state system. And in the sort of advance of a unipolar United States power, it was seen by many people, this theater, this successful theater, as empowering these non-state actors. And so it became widely popular, so even bin Laden's enemies joined him and called themselves Al-Qaeda. But by the way, Al-Qaeda was never in common use until the United States put the word out there in the Southern District Court of New York in 1990 for the bombing of the African embassies, when, just like in the Joe Valachi trial, the prosecutor asked Jamal al-Fadl, "Do you know of Al-Qaeda?" He says, "Well, it's a list." And who's on this list? Well, it was a list we made up in Afghanistan to track the Mujahideen. So Al-Qaeda is this organization by bin Laden. And what else does Al-Qaeda do? And by the time the end of the transcript is finished, Al-Qaeda becomes a concept that everybody's talking about. It's publicized around the world, and it's the first concept out there at 9/11. And suddenly everybody's Al-Qaeda. But if you go to Guantanamo and you ask the people, are they Al-Qaeda? They say no.
So can I just address? I really wish that he would have talked substance. And when we did talk substance, I noticed that, it seems as though he hadn't really learned much about Islam or studied it much. At one point at the end of our discussion, he asked me this question, where or how many Palestinian Christian suicide bombers can you name? And my jaw dropped for a moment, because I knew that he was asking this question 10 years ago. There's a YouTube clip where he asks Scott Atran, the anthropologist, where are the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers? And Scott Atran says that there is this organization called the PFLP, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that is mostly Marxist, mostly Christian, and they do suicide bombing. That was in 2006. I gave him the exact same answer to the exact same question 10 years later, and yet he clings to this idea of, this is practically a science experiment, right? I mean, just to forward the thesis that Muslims are somehow uniquely predisposed to suicide terrorism because of their religion. Again, we can't technically call that racist because Islam is not a race, but it's certainly an Orientalist and bigoted viewpoint, right? That doesn't stand up to even the smallest, the minutest amount of scrutiny.
What interests me, Sam Harris, is power and the powerful.
Okay.
And for me, I'm interested in who gets to decide who the other is, who gets to decide by what metric rationalism and religion is evaluated. And it seems to me that the kind of violence that's focused on in a lot of your work is the violence of desperate people, desperate and possibly subjugated people. And I would say to I know that you don't do this, but I want you to educate me on this. But to dismiss the colonial aspect, the sort of economic aspect, the occupation of Middle Eastern countries, the historical aspect. I mean, for me, it seems like how can you conduct that extraction? How can you divorce those different types of violence? They seem to me to be part of one narrative.
Well, I can do it very simply because you have just to dissect out the variable of colonialism or oppression from the outside. You have examples of people who have been oppressed, as oppressed as any other people who don't resort to this kind of violence because they don't have the same belief structure, right? So take that. Here's an almost perfect scientific experiment. You have Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims living in the same occupied territories, right? Now, who was before the Israelis put up the wall, who was blowing themselves up in pizza parlors and discotheques, right? It was 99.9% Muslim, right? It was not Christian.
Now, I don't know if Harris is doing this consciously to talk about modern intifada and the recent outbreak of terrorism. But if you look at even a broader historical context, the historical pioneer of Palestinian terror was a guy named George Habash, who was connected with Marxist-Leninist groups, Black September, and was in fact a Christian. He was a Greek Orthodox Christian and a Palestinian guerrilla movement leader, and absolutely we could fairly call him a terrorist because he did advocate targeting civilians. So even the Palestinian example is a lot more historically muddied than Harris would like to think. Now, we could go and point out all of the various sort of contradictions to this, right? There's the kamikaze pilots. There's the fact that the Tamil Tigers pioneered suicide bombing, so on and so forth. And this is where Harris really loses it, because you could still have a very conservative reading that was, still wanted to primarily place the blame elsewhere, not on U.S. or Western actions. If you go back to the 80s and the funding that the Pakistanis and the Saudis chose, and they chose to funnel into the most radical parts of the Mujahideen, there's a story in a book called Beating the Bear, which was written by a former Pakistani ISI official who helped run the Mujahideen for the Pakistani intelligence services. And they tell the story of a Mujahideen operation that the CIA and the Pakistanis wanted to do, where they would blow up a major bridge that was a vital link for Soviets running supplies into Afghanistan for their occupying forces. At this point in the 80s, essentially that operation, in order to do, would be, by necessity, be a suicide operation. In other words, if they sent two guys in there to blow up this tunnel, rather, it wasn't a bridge, it was a tunnel, to blow it up, they would die. Not necessarily like on purpose, like they wouldn't be strapped with explosives, but it was a suicide run. They couldn't get anybody to do it at this point because suicide missions were considered so haram by the Mujahideen. So you could say the rise of this as a political tactic is not only connected to the political conditions. I mean, Palestine is a really shaky example to use because that actually is where Pape's work on humiliation, which Harris totally dismisses and doesn't really understand, comes most into play, because that is a literal ongoing subjugation and humiliation of another people through occupation. But if you go into a broader context of how it accelerated in these Sunni groups, you could look at what the prime Sunni power chose to fund. They chose to fund the most right-wing reactionary forces, and that facilitated the most right-wing reactionary tactics. Do you think if a Somali Sufi group, as an example, moderate, in fact, mystical form of Islam that has been fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia, that along with other groups in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, if those more moderate forces and different types of guerrilla groups receive the vast bulk of funding and their tactics dominated, we wouldn't have a completely different geopolitical understanding of Islamic tactics. At another point in that interview, Harris said that essentially, and I'm going to paraphrase, but that ideas are sort of the most powerful. And I think that is a kind of actually really charmingly, unbelievably naive view of how the world works. Ideas are an after effect, and ideas are allowed to flourish when the context allows them to flourish. Sometimes that context is organic. I think there is a tremendous interest in things like Marxism now because of economic and material conditions. But there's also simply the reality that different systems allow for different ideologies to flourish at different times. And if you combine the failures of nationalist and left projects in the 70s, the rise of global religious fundamentalism filtered through things like Saudi and Pakistani foreign policy, you have a much better grip on why this current thing is manifesting. And by the way, we on our side can easily, and the last thing I'll say, I want you guys to jump in. The last thing I'll say is Russell Brand is totally right about this stuff, and we can easily in a conversation acknowledge obvious things like, yes, the Taliban was horrible to women. Yes, there is fundamentalist and fanatical religion and religious regimes that abuse people's rights across the globe. Yes, readings of Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism are toxic. And maybe even I would accept that probably Christianity, Islam, and Judaism might have more, they're less innately herbivorous than Buddhist or Jain doctrines, right? But if you don't historicize and you don't economize things, you're in a fantasy universe that leads either to a nice version that Harris criticizes, which is a sort of a sort of equal playing field where you're not making important distinctions, or in his case, where everything is these ahistorical quotes, which you can use to forward destructive and dangerous policy ideas, or at this point, it seems like since he primarily shies away from policy, just sort of hammering home the fact that he doesn't like Islam. The productivity of this for the broader debates about everything from human rights to migration to foreign policy to the evolving nature of democracy is utterly mystifying to me. Don't come I've read the quotes. I've read the Quran. I studied Islam. Okay, I get it. You coming at me and saying you're ignoring the hadith and da da da. What you don't understand is you think that we're pre-Harris in sophistication. We're post. Okay, you're having a juvenile conversation. I'm trying to actually get to a point of understanding this stuff, not to be politically correct and nice to Muslims, blah, 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 though I don't think being...
That's all I'm in it for.
Yeah. I mean, God forbid having like civility and respect in general. The same thing that... And by the way, the last point I'll make, they talk about double standards that liberals have. I have the same argument about Christianity. I don't agree with blanking statements about Christianity. Christianity manifests in many, many different ways, depending on geopolitical, historical, social context, and has been a force for tremendous good. Tremendous good. And I don't appreciate lazy liberal categorizations about Christianity either. And people will watch this and they'll say, Russell Brand's being a relativist. Russell Brand he is the one, the dude with the Ganesha tattoo. My man meditating with the expanded global consciousness is the one materializing the conversation and elevating it in a synchronized way.
Okay, so that that Sam Harris did when Russell Brand says he's interested in power, the thing Sam Harris likes to say about ideas is that they're powerful. So he's interested in how words are powerful, but he's not interested at all in actual power.
There has never been an analysis that he has started. And that's why the other thing too in his sort of game to be aware of is that if you talk about just a basic asymmetry of power. So let's concede the United States, for all of its global crimes of empire, which I don't know if Harris is fully familiar with, but is real.
He says he knows about them, but
Okay, but whatever. I'll try to take him at his word. I can still say, yes, there's no doubt that it is an on-the-ground experience. The barbarism of ISIS totally outweighs the United States. So the global crime toll of the United States is infinitely bigger than ISIS. On the ground, yes. U.S. troops, throwing people off buildings, burning people alive, raping children is not part of coin strategy, okay? We have evolved on some level, right? But the bigger structural reality is that ISIS is a speck compared to our presence in the world. So if you want to understand geopolitics, you have to go to the engines that are actually driving geopolitics. Harris's move then is he goes, okay, I understand that, but what if ISIS controlled the world? There's a thought experiment. And then you're off to the races in mental masturbation instead of reality discussion. It's very revealing. And I honestly mean this. If you're a fan of his and you have a resource that you could point me to correct me on this, I've searched far and wide for any type of sustained Harris commentary on the Iran nuclear deal, because that is the closest to a real-world non-thought experiment fantasy example of where all of this thinking, if we want to call it that, goes, which is that, okay, supposedly the Islamic Republic is this fanatic Muslim state, although it's really not. It's actually a very realist-oriented actor, if you understand it. But I'll even set that aside. Say it's a fundamentalist, fanatic Muslim state. It has the ability technologically to acquire a nuclear weapon, which, as Sam Harris has said in one of his previous thought of experiments, might, and I, again, I'm sure out of context, but it might. I think we can at least fairly say might. It might justify a preemptive attack if an Islamic regime had that capacity because they're apocalyptic. So out of the realm of all of this verbiage and thought experimenting and divorce from politics, this is a real-world example. This supposed serious hardcore Islamic state, which absolutely, by the way, if we're going to drag those other issues in, violates human rights at home, supports foreign policy goals that actually in Syria we're synchronized with in some ways, and other ways we don't like. That deal has worked 100%. There is no credible person, like no serious person in the realm, including people like Tillerson has been signing off on this and getting Trump to sign off on those reauthorizations every couple of months. There is nobody. And anybody in the policy apparatus who tries to undermine that deal tries to do it by doing side poison pills that aren't in the deal. There is no one in the policymaking world, in the energy world, who says that deal isn't happening. But just notice that tactic. Okay, Sam, what does that mean for Iran? Well, say that the Iranians ran the world. No, they don't. I'm talking about this world. But what if the ISIS ran the world? No, I'm not talking about.
I'm just talking about ideas.
Yeah, right. One of the ideas that I think has a lot of power to change the world is that dealing with reality is a great way to deal with reality. That's one of my ideas that Sam Harris waded into a debate because he saw some students at Middlebury shout down Charles Murray. Now, I think Charles Murray should be confronted and embarrassed and challenged wherever he goes. His work actually has, in fact, been debunked by serious scientists. It does have bizarre racial motivations, and underlying it is an extremist libertarian ideology. Harris sees this, and because Sam Harris's whole gig is actually just, at this point, a more intellectually refined version of whatever triggers the libtards must be true, has Charles Murray on his show, doesn't get into any depth on any of the policy questions that were just raised, doesn't have any, of course, as with everything else, is robustly ahistorical and has no situational awareness as where we are today. He raises some things like the Flynn effect, but basically doesn't challenge Murray on anything. Then there's a piece in Vox that robustly criticizes Murray and his work, and Harris does his usual thing, which has a meltdown, and it's unfair, and it's out of context, and it isn't right, and blah, 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 which is always his move. Now, in reality, Sam Harris jumped to his usual hoop, which is that the greatest threat in the world today is college students or an intolerant left, that whole meme, and jumped on board with Charles Murray, who is at the very least controversial and highly disputed in this field, who has a policy agenda that Harris doesn't even get into. Then there's pushback, and then Harris does his usual sullen sulk out of context thing, which led us to the Ezra Klein blow up of basically Harris and Klein going back and forth over email, and it's starting with Ezra Klein being like, well, I would go on your podcast, but I think it'd be better if you had someone like Nisbet, who's one of the authors in the piece on Vox, who actually challenged you and Murray. Harris, is like, Nisbet is not mainstream. Nisbet is actually quite mainstream, teaches at University of Michigan, and is very respected in the field, and is in fact, at credentialed universities. Charles Murray's at a think tank. Also bearing in mind, while Sam Harris is doing this whole victim complex thing about Charles Murray because of the thing at Middlebury, which I agree wasn't the right strategic approach to Murray at all, but Charles Murray has never been silenced. Charles Murray's, one of his recent books was reviewed in the New York Times twice. He is quoted on, article and journal pieces all over the place. He's been on everything from mainstream news programs to Bill Maher.
It's more accurate to say he's heavily subsidized.
He is a heavily subsidized public intellect since at least the 70s, whose writings and theorizings on everything are readily available to anyone. So that frame is, again, just utterly delusional. And, and Sam doesn't have any sense of the policy or the funding or any of those other areas that he doesn't have any discipline or interest in thinking about. So Ezra Klein and he have this whole exchange, which always just, again, returns again and again and again to Klein raising points, whether they be controversies inside the field, which Harris is ignoring and discounting, or broader political and ethical concerns, which, don't fit inside Harris's narrow, rigid worldview, which he discounts. And then it all culminated in Klein writing actually a very thoughtful piece, which also gets into Stamped from the Beginning, which is a brilliant book on the construction of racism in our history, and this sort of attempt to naturalize it. And the point that, of course, in fact, that two affluent white guys sitting around speculating about, black people being dumb is not only, it's like saying that two people fucking in porn is novel. This is one of the most, common activities in American history, and something that has so much destructiveness on so many different levels. By the way, these statistics are not what's in debate. That's not the issue. The issue is this much broader contextual conversation around them, which actually is what is relevant to the extent any of these numbers are relevant to measure to begin with. By the way, brief tangent. I mean, Harris particularly keeps harping on, Murray at least has a policy agenda here. I want to prove and naturalize these things so we don't do anything about them in terms of redistribution and addressing injustice. That's why he does what he does. Harris is on this whole treat everybody like an individual, and the only way to do it is be an individual, in which case, great. Then you should have zero interest in any distributional differences in any metric. You should only be interested in individual IQ, period. Individual this, individual that. If that you're going to make a fetish of your ideology, you shouldn't even be interested in these conversations. That being said, I think that this kind of putting this stuff out there is actually a sort of, this could play into epigenetic trauma in and of itself. And that's science. That's not posturing. So Sam released the emails, and Ezra wrote a good piece, and Sam looked like a pestilent child having a controlled emotional breakdown, which is what he is. Because actually, really, what is revealed in this stuff is just a pathological inability to absorb any criticism that is not tightly defined in his terms. And now he received such a backlash. And I think it's also important from a brand position because, Ezra Klein, look, if somebody like a Glenn Greenwald, who I totally respect, I have disagreements with, but Glenn's great. But, Glenn's a serious intellect, but Glenn's a polemicist. Glenn's on the left. Glenn doesn't pretend to value the things that Harris fetishizes in a disingenuous way. But Ezra Klein is that. Ezra Klein is civil Spock. And he exemplified all of the virtues that these people constantly go on about. Civil, respectful, open exchange of ideas, intellectually broad, data-focused, up-to-date with all of the latest research in all relevant fields. And Sam Harris had a tantrum and released private emails without permission. If you're somebody who is gung-ho about the Islam stuff but concerned about the racism stuff, you have to see, and I'm not saying I understand there are some distinctions between a group of people as an ethnicity and a religious belief, although it's certainly not as neat as people try to make that conversation. But if you can't see the through line of